Today's video is sponsored by Shudder. Shudder is the streaming service with the best selection of horror, thriller, and supernatural movies, series, and originals. From Hollywood favorites and cult classics to original series and critically acclaimed new genre films you won't find anywhere else, streaming uncut and commercial-free right to your favorite devices. Also, they now have a Golden Globe nominee. Shudder's La Llorona was recently nominated for the Best Foreign Language Feature Golden Globe. This title, which also won Best Film at the 2019 Venice Film Festival, was an unofficial selection to Sundance 2020. It blends together the terror of both myth and reality into a devastating expose of the genocidal atrocities against the Mayan community in Guatemala. You can stream great thrillers, horror, and suspense for $5.99 a month or $56.99 a year. Shudder has the largest, fastest-growing human-curated selection of thrilling and dangerous entertainment. It's called the Netflix of horror for a reason. There are new supernatural terrors, edge-of-your-seat thrillers, and shocking horrors added every week. You'll have unlimited access to stream ad-free on all your favorite devices: iPhone, Apple TV, Roku, Android devices, and many more. Shudder has a unique collection of exclusive and original films and series, horror classics, and blockbuster hits. Recently, I really enjoyed The Dark and the Wicked. On a secluded farm, a man is slowly dying. Bedridden and fighting through his final breaths, his wife is slowly succumbing to overwhelming grief. To help their mother and say goodbye to their father, siblings Louise and Michael return to their family farm. It doesn't take long for them to see that something's wrong with Mom, though. Something more than her heavy sorrow. Brian Bertino's latest film may be his best. Every scene produces a sense of escalating dread, and that can only be credited to the excellent cinematography, editing, and sound design and acting. This is a film with many layers, and while some are tried and true horror conventions, Bertino does more than enough to carve them out into his own unique nihilistic vision. And this is a must-watch on Shudder. So don't hesitate. Get started streaming the best horror, thriller, and supernatural content. Shudder's expertly curated collection includes must-see titles like Color Out of Space, Host, The Mortuary Collections, plus all the best horror documentaries and the hit Creepshow TV series from executive producer Greg Nicotero of The Walking Dead. To try Shudder free for 30 days, go to shudder.com and use promo code letsread. That's Shudder, SHUDDER.com, and use promo code LETSREAD.
I live just outside of Mission, Texas, which is maybe only 30 or 40 minutes drive from the Mexican border and a city called Reynosa. People make a big deal out of border security, but it's actually not entirely unusual for people to take day trips over to Mexico from where I'm from. You and your family can meet up, drive over the border, and all get authentic Mexican food while picking up medication and designer clothes for a fraction of American prices. As for me, I also have family in Reynosa, so me and my parents ventured over the border even more frequently than most. Those tended to be all-day events too, because my mom and my aunt would talk for hours and hours, and it wasn't out of the ordinary for us to drive back to the United States after the sun had set. So this one trip to visit my aunt back in 2009 started off like any other day. Hadn't heard anything on the news that might have changed our minds about traveling. We didn't have a care in the world. We ended up shopping like all day, having dinner with relatives, and it's around midnight by the time we start thinking about heading back. Since I was the oldest, Mom put me in charge of getting my little brother and sister into the car, then tells us to wait there for her. We're pretty tired by that point, so after a few minutes of sitting in the car, I fell asleep, just straight up passed out. Next thing I know, I'm suddenly awakened by a blinding light. I'm super startled and confused, and it takes me a minute to realize what's going on. But in front of the car, I can see what was unmistakably the shape of my mom silhouetted by some really bright headlights. I start trying to calm down my little brother and sister in the back seat, as they seem to immediately detect that something is wrong and start freaking out. Shortly after that, my mom is joined by my aunt, and as they're standing there, they're visibly shaking. Like I can actually see them trembling from a couple of feet away, and they were that scared. My eyes finally adjust to the bright light, and I can see that the vehicle with the bright headlights is this massive, lifted Ford F-250. This thing was a monster, and I had no idea who was driving it, only that my mom and aunt seemed to be terrified of them. The Ford's engine starts revving really loud, and in the back seat my siblings were wailing, so I had no idea what my mom was saying, but her body language told me that she was pleading with the people in the truck, like practically begging them. Whoever's in the truck begins to rapidly flicker his high beams, filling our car with blinding light, then immediately thrusting it back into darkness. Slowly, it dawns on me what's actually happening. The border cartels use big, black off-road vehicles just like that, and they're not just drug traffickers. They'll do just about anything illegal to make money, so they're not above kidnapping everyday Mexicans and holding them for ransom. The black Ford begins to rev its engines again, almost like it's taunting my mother, daring her to move. I couldn't just leave my mom and aunt out there alone, so I went to climb out of the passenger seat to back them up. I don't know what help I would have been, but I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. Only as soon as I opened the door, my mom and aunt spin around and start yelling at me to stay in the car. Hearing the raw fear in their voices made me all the more terrified, and I was really starting to lose it as I sat back in the seat. That horrible feeling of helplessness had me panicking so hard, and there was this stomach-churning moment when I thought I might not make it out of there. I'll never forget what happened next. All of a sudden, my mom and aunt both bolt for their doors. The second she moved, I heard the truck begin to shift into gear, and I knew we were in serious trouble. My mom moved faster than I'd ever seen her move before, ripping open the door and hurling herself into the driver's seat and waiting for my aunt to enter as well. Every one of us is in tears as she fires up our little Nissan and tears past the cartel truck before I had a chance to react. But as we speed off down this bumpy, unpaved road, the truck stayed close behind. I look at my mom, and tears are just pouring down her face. My aunt is in complete shock, and she's praying in Spanish for God to help us as we start reaching speeds well over 70 miles per hour in a residential area. My mom, obviously filled with adrenaline and the motherly instinct to protect her children, drives like I've never seen her drive before. With the truck still in hot pursuit, my mom tells me to buckle up. I turned back to the truck one last time to see the windows rolled down and men peering out, possibly recording or taking photos of the back of my mom's vehicle. My mom avoided traffic, nearly wrecking twice, but was determined to not stop until we reached the U.S. border. Only when we were about 5 miles or so from the border checkpoint did the black Ford stop following us. I felt like I'd held my breath the entire time, and seeing the lack of headlights behind us brought about a kind of relief I've not felt before or since. My mom actually ran a red light on the way back too. She didn't care either. She just floored it until we were back on U.S. soil. We reported the incident to the U.S. Border Patrol, who took statements from us all but really couldn't do much else. The craziest thing was how quickly my brother and sister fell asleep once things had calmed down. I don't think they knew what was actually happening, and I found myself envying their blissful ignorance. We didn't go back to Mexico until 2014 when one of my other aunts passed away. We still go back from time to time, but it's so unsafe that I hate it. Helicopters patrolling the air so low to the ground you can see the officers' fingers on the triggers of their onboard turrets, like something out of a war movie. I wish I could see more of Mexico. I mean, it's where my heritage lies, but I've heard and experienced too many things to want to go exploring anytime soon. I just hope that one day, Mexico solves the problem of the cartels, and people can live in peace again. My name is Ramon, and I am from the capital city of Honduras. It is called Tegucigalpa, but I know a lot of North Americans have trouble saying this word. Don't worry, many people from all over Central and South America have trouble saying this word too. and I love Honduras, but it's a very poor country and there is a long history of war and violence here. My brother left for the US many years ago, and he still lives in Chicago with a good job and beautiful family now that he has a green card, but I will be truthful when I say he did not enter the country properly. He used a Mexican coyote, what they call people smugglers, and I thought I could do the same thing, but this turned out not to be true, and when I tried to get across the border, my journey turned into a nightmare. I made it through Guatemala quite easily. There's a lot of movement between our two countries, and the men at border control didn't even ask to see my passport. But when we got to the Mexican border, everything changed. There were people, bad people, waiting to help us get across into Mexico, but when I say help us, all they wanted was money. Money to get into Mexico and even more money to get into the United States. We had no choice. We had to pay the coyotes, those who didn't suddenly find themselves being picked up by La Policia and sent back the way they came, or worse. The whole thing was like a game, a rigged game, and we never stood a chance. When I was picked up, I was about halfway through Chiapas in the south of Mexico, walking with another group of migrants. We all tried to run, but I was too tired and too slow. The officer ran me down, put me in cuffs, and then threw me in the back of his car. In Mexico, they treat us Central Americans even worse than the United States. If I got caught in the US, at least I'd get food and water in jail. But getting arrested in Mexico made jail seem like a luxury. From what I'd heard, sometimes the Mexican police don't even take you to jail. They just drive us back to the Guatemalan border and kick us out onto the other side. And since this cop was driving me out of town, I figured that's what was happening to me too. But no, we didn't go to any police station and we didn't drive to the border. When the cop finally stopped the car and told me to get out, I started to get really scared. We were at what looked like a rundown old farm, crumbling buildings being reclaimed by the land, and the people he handed me over to didn't look like regular police. They all wore black military clothes, body armor. Some of them even had hand grenades attached to their chests too, like they were special forces soldiers. But they weren't soldiers. Those men were cartel, and they were about to make my life torturous for 7 long days. As soon as they got their hands on me, the torture began. They beat me with wooden planks and the handles of their pistols. Then, when I was knocked out, they shocked me with live wires to wake me up again. And this went on for hours and hours, and the whole time I'm begging them to stop, to at least tell me what I did to deserve all this pain. Finally, they began to ask me questions. My name, where I was from, names of my family. I told them everything. By that point, I would have done anything to stop the pain. The next morning, a man walked into the room that I was being held in and put a cell phone to my ear. I recognized the voice on the other end right away. It was my mother, and she was crying. The cartel told me to tell my mother to send $5,000, and as soon as he did, my heart sank. My family is poor, very poor. My mother and father only make around $400 a month, and that's from working 6 days a week. There's no way they would be able to get that money. But I did as I was told, and told my mother that I was being held prisoner, and that only $5,000 would pay for my release. Obviously, my mother is wailing and crying, telling me she doesn't have that kind of money, and she tells the cartel men this as well. They responded by shocking me with the wires again and putting the cell phone near my mouth so that my mother could hear my screams. She was broken by what she heard and told the cartel that she would do whatever she could to raise the money. She would call back when she had it, but until then, I would have to remain in the cartel jail. It didn't take me long to realize that I wasn't the only prisoner at this makeshift jail, and that as bad as my treatment had been, it could have been much worse. I didn't see much of what went on, but from what I heard, many of the other prisoners were members of a rival group, maybe the Gulf Cartel. They were being tortured for information, and every single day I could hear their screams echoing around the old farmhouse. They were doing much worse things to them too, killing them, cutting them up, and then burning their corpses somewhere nearby. I know because you don't forget the smell of burning people, ever. I didn't see any of the carnage, really. The sounds were bad enough. But once I saw something when I was being taken out for washing that will stay for me for the rest of my life. You have to understand, these cartel members have seen so much that they were completely numb to death and suffering. It was like a joke to them, and I only understood that when I saw a cartel soldier with a severed arm of someone he had cut up. He used it to wave to another group of soldiers, and all they did was laugh, like it was the funniest joke of their lives. Another time, a cartel captain opened up my cell when I was sleeping and threw something at me. It was dark and I couldn't tell what it was at first. The man said, "If your family don't get our money, this will happen to you too." And then he left. I reached out into the darkness to feel what it was and felt what I thought was hair on my fingertips. I traced them down and felt something warm and soft and wet. Then I realized what it was. It was a human head. 2 weeks went by before I heard from my family again. Somehow, my brother in Chicago, along with my family and friends back in Honduras, had managed to put together the ransom money, and they had it wired to Mexico. I was so relieved that I cried when I heard the news. I felt a sensation like nothing I've ever felt before. My family had saved my life. I can barely describe the horror I felt when the cartel told me that I wouldn't be released. They wanted double the amount of money now that my family had proven they could raise the money. After that, the cartel said my family had stopped answering their phones, and I was crushed. The only question then was what they would do with me. At first, I was sure they would just kill me. One day, the cartel put me in a van, and I thought that they would take me somewhere to shoot me, but instead, they transferred me to a different prison, where there was at least 100 other prisoners. Every day, they would take out 2 or 3 of us for torture. Sometimes I couldn't think of anything because of the pain. Other times I would just sit there wondering how people could be that bad. Every week, about 5 migrants whose families had paid nothing were taken away, and we never saw or heard from them again. One day, I was taken into a room where, for the first time in weeks, my hands were untied and I was allowed to sit in a chair like a person again. A cartel man wearing a mask offered me a cigarette before explaining that I had a ticket out of prison. All I had to do was join them. They would send me into the jungle for 3 months of training. After that, I would be paid $5,000 a month, and I'd be a full member of the Los Zetas cartel. All I wanted to do was see my family. That's all I wanted in the entire world, but when I asked if I could see them, even after the training, they said no. I was told the only way out of the Zetas is death or jail. I hesitated. I know I should have said yes, but the idea of never seeing my mother or father again was just too much. I couldn't say yes to them and flew into a rage. They beat me longer and harder than they ever had before, and I don't remember anything for a while after that. The next thing I remember was someone shaking me awake and asking if I was okay. I had no idea where I was, but I knew I was not with the cartel anymore. No one had asked how I was in more than a week. My eyes were so swollen from the beating that I could barely see, and I asked this mysterious person where I was, and they told me I was in Reynosa, near the border with Texas. By that afternoon, I was in a hospital that was almost 900 miles from where I had first been picked up. I was vomiting blood. I could barely speak or see, and my entire body ached from the beatings. It took me almost a week to recover, almost as long as I spent in that cartel jail. It was the worst time of my life, but things got much better for me after that. It turns out, at least from talking to my nurse and doctors, that they just dropped me off. My debt was paid. I was able to apply for asylum in the United States because I had been tortured in Mexico, and now I live near my brother and his family in Chicago. I hope to be able to bring my wife and children from Honduras too, and I worry about them every single day, and I hope I can bring them a better life here. I know life in the United States is not perfect, but I feel safe here. I know my family can prosper in a place like Chicago where there is a large Latino community, a place we can be safe from the horror and the violence that I went through. It's like something out of a horror movie. Strewn among a thick blanket of ash on the floor of a single-story house are all the accoutrements of imprisonment, torture, and slaughter. Blood-stained clothes, plastic cable ties, rusty machetes, scorched bone fragments. The pure horror of the scene punctuated by the bloody handprints on the walls. Outside, just a few feet away, stands a traditional brick oven that was once used to make the traditional Mexican corn dish, zacahuil. But after the Los Zetas drug cartel took over the ranch in 2011, its purpose changed dramatically, as the Zetas began using it to incinerate its victims. The practice has become so common in northern Veracruz, where the gore-soaked house stands, that to zacahuil has become a euphemism referring to the incineration of human corpses. And to the forensic investigators, whose job it is to sift through the ashes for fragments of human bone, teeth, and nails, it's just another day at the office. As this particular kitchen in La Gajera is just one of 12 that have been found over recent months. The Mexican drug cartel known as Los Zetas came into existence when a group of ex-Special Forces operators who had deserted their posts to become enforcers for the Gulf Cartel decided they want a bigger cut of the profits. Instead of negotiating with their employers, they broke away entirely, taking all of their brutally effective expertise with them. They randomly massacred entire buses full of innocent people, recorded and distributed videos of them beheading their rivals with chainsaws, and single-handedly perpetrated the worst atrocity in Mexico's war on drugs, the San Fernando Massacre, in which 193 people were executed by the Zetas in just over 4 days at a ranch out in Tamaulipas. But that number is but a drop in the water compared to the 250,000 Mexican lives lost since the beginning of Felipe Calderón's campaign against the drug cartels, a conflict that turned out to be a messy soup of shifting alliances, armed militia groups, and deep-running state corruption that U.S. and Mexican authorities seem to be attempting to eat with a fork. Conservative estimates based on government reports suggest that up to 60,000 Mexicans have been disappeared in Los Zeta kitchens over the past 15 years. Yet there have only been 6 Mexican federal court convictions on charges of forced disappearance. One of the reasons behind the horrifyingly low number of convictions is that the disappearances aren't the responsibility of just one criminal group, and are done so for a variety of reasons. Government forces of cartel groups, sometimes working in tandem, are thought to kidnap, murder, and vanish people for organ harvesting, slavery, ransoms, or to suppress political opponents. Sometimes in Mexico, local government or police forces are so corrupt that they refuse to investigate cartel charnel houses, and it's down to grassroots organizations such as the 5th National Search Brigade for the Disappeared to uncover the cartel's grisly work all on their own. And it was the 1st National Search Brigade that uncovered the cartel kitchens in Veracruz. Under the protection of the heavily armed police task force, volunteers spent 2 whole weeks scouring northern Veracruz for hidden kill houses and mass graves. They found a number of hidden kill houses, but perhaps even more disturbing were the makeshift prisons that they uncovered, places where those that have offended the cartels are left to rot in deep, dark places, fed only the bare minimum until they simply lose their minds. Volunteer groups also collect DNA samples from willing members of the public, forming a kind of amateur genetic society to combat gross state negligence that is almost certainly exacerbated by bribery and corruption. One of the volunteers who searched the house that day is a woman named Angelis. Angelis was personally affected by the mass disappearances when her own son vanished in March of 2016. He disappeared from the city of Poza Rica, and the prevailing theory is that Angel was kidnapped by state police officers before being handed over to the drug cartels. But why they would do such a thing is complete guesswork for Angelis, who has since explained that she has received no response from the relevant authorities. "I have no doubt that those bones are from human beings," she says as she searches the property. "Maybe they're from my son, or the children of my comrades, and we'll never find them." Separate searches found 6 beheaded bodies, children's skulls, femur, pelvic, and jaw bones, and hundreds of charred bone fragments. The involvement of actual serving police officers in cartel disappearances and botched or non-existent investigations are a recurring theme in the testimonies of Mexican civilians. A well-known instance of this was the kidnapping of 43 students from the Ayotzinapa College in 2014. An official government report discovered the students were kidnapped by municipal police officers, then handed over to a drug gang before they simply vanished from the face of the earth. Following his 2011 arrest by Mexican Marines, a Los Zetas capo named Karim gave a signed statement to federal prosecutors. In it, he not only admitted to being an ex-police officer, but also detailed the locations of 2 other kitchens that the cartel used to cook people. Both kitchens happened to be close to Poza Rica, the very same place that Anjali's son went missing. Karim also admitted that he and his colleagues paid $22,500 a month to corrupt police officers in the state of Veracruz, and that he had dozens of officers on his payroll. This explains why the local government of Veracruz took very little action against cartel kill houses, complaints, and reports simply weren't being acted upon because it was in their interest to keep the kill houses operating. For Alejandra Alvarez, a volunteer with the search brigade, the scene at La Gajera was the worst thing he had ever seen, worse than any horror film. But Alejandro was also quick to add that the La Gajera kill house is not the least bit unique. "Practically the whole country is a mass grave," he said during an interview with the members of the Mexican press. "The whole world needs to know that people were dissolved in acid in Mexico because the government allowed it to happen. One day there will be monuments throughout the country, like in Germany, plaques with faces, names, and stories of the disappeared, as a reminder of what happened in these places, as a way to say, never again." Another volunteer present at the La Gajera house is named Mario Vergara, who has been searching for his brother Tomas. Tomas disappeared on July 5, 2012, not far from where the 43 Ayotzinapa students went missing. Mario explained to a gaggle of local journalists that those who search for their disappeared relatives face a mammoth task, as some methods of extermination leave no traces of the victims behind. "We once went to an area where they were feeding them to crocodiles. Of course there wasn't a trace," Vergara said. "So how are we going to make the government understand that people disappear when there's nothing left?" The cartel have also been known to dissolve bodies in acid, or to cremate them at extremely high temperatures so that not a single fragment of bone remains. The horror of dissolving corpses in sulfuric acid or murdering hundreds at a time is obvious enough. But perhaps the most terrifying, soul-crushing aspect of these cases is that the very people that should be trusted to protect the public are either complicit or refuse to act on the tens of thousands of disappearances. In the majority of the Western world, we trust that the police have our best interests at heart, and are shocked and appalled whenever this proves to be false. But in Mexico, it seems the police are just as much a threat to happiness and prosperity as the drug cartels they claim to fight. Since early July of 2017, there have been reports from almost 200 travelers describing unexplainable injuries, illnesses, and deaths after drinking alcohol at Mexican tourist resorts. Hundreds of vacationers have returned with tales of blacking out after drinking even the smallest amounts of booze, before waking up to find that they were robbed, assaulted, hospitalized, or even taken to jail. But when the victims tried to report the incidents, they encountered unhelpful or downright hostile resort workers, hospital staffers, and police officers. Even the U.S. State Department seemed slow or unwilling to help. But at least they were quick to explain that it was because they were unable to investigate or prosecute crimes on foreign soil. Shockingly, When these tourists attempted to warn others of their experiences using the website TripAdvisor, the company responded by deleting dozens of posts, citing trolling as their reason for doing so. But what exactly was the cause of these mysterious blackouts? Who might be responsible for them? And why did the victims come up against such resistance when they attempted to report them? In February of 2018, Wisconsin couple Richard and Marian Peterson decided to treat themselves, escaping the frigid north for a week-long cruise in the Gulf of Mexico. At some point, the cruise stopped for a day at Nachicocom Beach Club, a private resort in Cozumel, where the Petersons ordered a pair of margaritas from the bar. The drinks were whisked over to the luxury beach canopy the 60-year-old couple were occupying, but no less than 30 minutes after their initial toast, the couple began to feel violently ill. It wasn't long before Richard and Marian were stumbling down the beach and emptying their stomachs into the water. Resort staff offered to call a paramedic, but the couple declined, fearing that they would miss their cruise ship's departure. But when they managed to make it back on board, they blacked out for about 2 hours, awaking to find that they had almost no memory of the day's events. It was at that point it dawned on the couple that they might well have been drugged, or at least given tainted alcohol. Even earlier, in May of 2017, the Drinkwine family of Castle Pines, Colorado, took their 3 children south of the border for a summer vacation. And there was an added bonus for 19-year-old Bobby Drinkwine. Given that the legal drinking age in Mexico is 18, his parents had given their permission for Bobby to have the odd beer with his dinner. Then one night, after some entertainment at the Iberosta Paraiso del Mar resort, Bobby decided to hang around the bar after his parents went to bed at around 11. 45 minutes later, Jennifer Drinkwine, Bobby's mother, returned to the bar after getting a bad feeling in her gut, only to find her son to be dangerously intoxicated, stumbling around and completely incoherent. Bar staff told Jennifer that Bobby had only had 1 drink that evening, a shot of tequila, an amount of alcohol that would have had little to no effect on the 6-foot-tall, 200-pound teenager. Bobby's mother called for a golf cart to transport him back to his room, given that he could barely walk, and resort staff had to hold on to Bobby tightly to keep him from falling off the cart. "We both were just as scared to death," she said. "We thought we were going to lose him." By that point, Bobby was turning pale and his eyes were rolling into their sockets. His parents wasted no time in calling paramedics. But when the emergency medical personnel arrived on scene, they refused to give Bobby any treatment, claiming that he was simply intoxicated and there was no medical emergency. Bobby's parents pleaded with them to help, but the EMTs refused to even help Bobby onto a stretcher. It was like just touching him would be a death sentence for them. Bobby's parents had to lift their own son into a waiting taxi so they could take him to a nearby hospital for treatment. At the hospital, doctors took the same view as the EMTs and falsely deduced that Bobby was drunk. However, a subsequent medical exam showed that his blood alcohol content was just less than 0.02%, meaning Bobby was well within the drunk driving limit. For all intents and purposes, Bobby was sober as a judge, so why was he having such an adverse reaction to whatever he drank? Thankfully, doctors had Bobby stay overnight so they could monitor his condition, and over the next 8 hours or so, he slowly recovered. But Jennifer Drinkwine is convinced that her son would have died if she hadn't gone back to that bar to check on him. "They're trying to make out like these kids are reckless," she said, "but they're not. Something else is going on here." Then, just a few months later in July of 2017, Jennifer Santo and her family were staying at an all-inclusive resort in Tulum. Neither Jennifer nor her family had heard any stories of counterfeit alcohol or tourists blacking out, and naturally spent their first full day in Mexico sunning themselves by the pool and drinking at the swim-up bar. Not long into their afternoon of doggy paddling and cocktails, the Santo kids noticed that their parents were acting a little out of character. They seemed extremely drunk despite having only had a few glasses of Purple Rain, and began vomiting and blacking out after being escorted back to their rooms. Obviously, the incident was pretty much identical to others that had occurred, but in this case, Jennifer Santel was able to provide some crucial insight into the nature of the blackouts. "When I woke up at 7 p.m., it was an instant awakening," she said. "It was like when I woke up from anesthesia after my gallbladder surgery. It's different than waking up from sleep or with a hangover, and I suspected that we were drugged." The various media outlets reached out to the resorts in question, who admitted they were aware of the incidents given their prolific nature, but they also say that a number of investigations into potential foul play have brought up nothing. This is in stark contrast with reports that the Mexican police have had to shut down half a dozen black market tequila distilleries owned and operated by the cartels that are thought to have produced hundreds of thousands of gallons of counterfeit alcohol. But what makes this counterfeit alcohol so dangerous is that it's produced using a substance known as methanol. Sometimes known by its other name, wood alcohol, methanol is a solvent more commonly found in things like windshield washer fluid, and even in the smallest of doses can prove to be extremely toxic. What we appear to be looking at is a huge cartel conspiracy to flood the Mexican market with counterfeit tequila, and the unwillingness of authorities to deal with the complaints of tourists is down to the very tangible threat of torture, death, and disappearance. The terrifying truth of the matter is that, thanks to the Mexican cartels, you could take a shot of tequila in a Mexican resort and not know if it's the real McCoy or something considerably more deadly. In early 2010, the Mexican drug cartel Los Zetas violently split from their parent Gulf cartel, kicking off a violent conflict between the two groups that left hundreds dead. The first set-piece battle occurred in the border town of Reynosa, but the fires of war quickly spread to nearby Nuevo Laredo and Matamoros. In the midst of violence and panic, authorities and media initially attempted to downplay the situation, but it wasn't long before the Gulf cartel began to string up the bodies of slain Zetas from light poles, and it wasn't so easy to sweep the gang wars under the rug. The Zetas hit back hard, and the Gulf cartel knew that if they wanted to end the war quickly and relatively bloodless, they would have to launch a critical strike deep in the heart of the Zeta stronghold, San Fernando. Los Zetas were suddenly on the back foot, and losing the prized territory of San Fernando would be a huge blow to their fledgling operation. The municipality of San Fernando is a virtual spiderweb of dirt roads that connect with Monterrey, Nuevo Laredo, Reynosa, and Matamoros, making it a prized territory for drug traffickers. The Zetas were primarily low on manpower, and so drastic measures had to be taken to find new recruits. The first signs of the Zetas' brutal new recruitment tactic came to light in August of 2010. Mexican naval infantry made a horrifying discovery at the rural compound in the San Fernando area: the dead bodies of 72 migrant workers. 58 men and 14 women appeared to have been straight up executed, and the reason behind such a slaughter was a complete mystery up until an Ecuadorian survivor showed up at a nearby military checkpoint. He had faked his death in order to escape from what he described as a cartel training camp. Kidnapped individuals would be held to ransom, but once their families paid the money owed, the Zetas would simply deny their captives freedom and instead force them to join their ranks. Those who could not raise any ransom money or who refused to join them would be murdered in cold blood. The Zetas routinely targeted undocumented migrants since they had little recourse or ways to defend themselves. Authorities believed that such drastic, brutal actions would be short-lived, given their horrific nature and the ongoing cartel conflict, but, as it turned out, the horror had only just begun. Throughout March of 2011, several public transportation buses that were heading to Reynosa were hijacked in the San Fernando area. Authorities found a few of the buses completely abandoned and burned out in a few isolated spots in the surrounding countryside. But what happened to the passengers was a complete mystery for several weeks, at least up until April 6th, when Mexican authorities found 59 bodies and 8 clandestine mass graves, with most being identified as the missing passengers. This discovery led officials to acknowledge that the Mexican drug cartels had begun to inflict fear through a new and terrifying method, stopping random buses and removing passengers, some never to be seen again. 2 weeks before the bodies were found, there were reports of buses being hijacked by the cartels near San Fernando, where cartel members would stop the bus, select passengers, take them hostage, with the goal being recruitment, extortion, and terror. By the time the death toll reached 72, bus lines in Tamaulipas refused to take people to San Fernando until the situation was resolved. Investigators began to mention that those killed were not immigrants, like the previous massacre of the 72 migrants in 2010, but fellow Mexican citizens. Houston Chronicle journalist Dane Schiller interviewed an alleged cartel member who explained Los Zetas had been using an ancient Roman gladiator blood sport to groom new assassins and to find recruits for their organization. The kidnapped victims were forced to fight to the death with other prisoners. Men were given knives, hammers, and machetes, and were ordered at gunpoint to fight for their lives like a gladiator-style contest. The winners were ordered to go on missions and shoot at rival drug cartel members elsewhere. The dead were buried in mass graves, with almost all the corpses found in the mass graves had evidence of blunt force trauma. A cartel member on trial in Laredo, Texas, testified that the fighting contests between the kidnapped victims were ordered by Miguel Trevino Morales, a high-ranking Zeta lieutenant, and that they were used to make the killers lose their fear. The situation is so bad that Mexican Federal Highway 101, which extends from the border city of Matamoros to Ciudad Victoria, is known by local residents as the Highway of Death. Those who traveled through this highway in 2010 and 2011 used to see burned vehicles, bullet-shot trucks on the side of the road, and dead bodies, often decapitated, that the cartels would leave behind. Others who have traveled through this highway and have survived carjackings and checkpoints the organized crime groups have installed from Padilla to San Fernando have reported what happens on the highway. A survivor saw 4 SUVs, all gray and with tinted windows, adding that everyone was armed. The violence and constant carjackings were so frequent that bus lines avoided Highway 101 by driving miles out of their way. Another survivor stated that heavily armed men would stop buses at roadblocks and then force women and young girls at gunpoint, strip them naked, violate them, and then drive away in trucks, leaving the passengers traumatized. One bus driver, who said he had avoided being stopped thus far, claimed that another bus driver at the station had said that 12 people were pulled off the bus just 30 minutes before him. Other witnesses claimed that once the buses were stopped, gunmen would storm the bus and point at certain passengers and say, you're coming down," and take them at gunpoint. The buses were then ordered to leave. Highway 101 is the biggest and most important transportation system in the state of Tamaulipas, and it connects the state with Matamoros and Texas with the rest of Tamaulipas. Local residents mention that there's only traffic on this highway during daylight. As of 2012, they mentioned that the cartels still kill people in San Fernando, leading to the U.S. issuing travel warnings south of the border. On June 17, 2011, federal police captured Edgar Montiel, a high-ranking boss in Los Zetas, and the man responsible for the killing of 72 migrants in 2010. He confessed during interrogation that more than 600 bodies were buried in the clandestine mass graves near San Fernando, unconfirmed by Mexican authorities. Members of an anti-kidnapping group suggest that the mass graves in San Fernando contain more than 500 dead, but that the government of Tamaulipas has not released such information because of the political troubles it may instigate. Just a few months prior, Mexican authorities captured Martin Luna, a sub-boss of Los Zetas in San Fernando, and responsible for at least 217 killings in that locality. Along with Luna, 11 additional Zeta gunmen were apprehended, men linked to the killing of a policeman and investigator who were covering the massacres. In addition, Estrada Luna was one of the masterminds of the massacre of the 72 migrants and of the mass graves found. He was regarded by the DEA as one of the most aggressive leaders in Los Zetas organization. Yet no matter how many Los Zetas gunmen or bosses are arrested or killed, the organization and the ideals it stands for live on without them. The cartels operate in an environment where narcotics, money, and brutal violence rule all, and unfortunately, there's no shortage of people willing to use one to get the others. But what's particularly disturbing about the cartel is that they seem willing to use methods that we might normally associate with a major terrorist organization. The low value these men place on life is the most shocking thing of all, but the power that attitude brings must be far too intoxicating for some to refuse. And as the ranks of the cartel are swelled even by those who hate or fear them, I fear the cycle of violence is doomed to repeat itself over and over again until there are no more people left to kill. In 1910, a revolution kicked off 10 years of political and cultural turmoil that transformed the Mexican state. But much like any other revolution, such drastic change was paid for in blood, and a series of violent conflicts tore through the Mexican countryside. As a result, Mexican refugees poured into Texas in the hopes of escaping a brutal civil war that didn't discriminate between soldier or civilian. So many Mexicans sought refuge north of the border that the Mexican population more than tripled from 1910 to 1920, and it didn't take long for that chaos of the revolution to spill over the border into the United States. From around 1910 to 1914, a group known as the Carrancistas launched a series of raids into the U.S., violent forays onto ranch lands to steal livestock and valuables to ride back over the border with. Tensions escalated as Texas Rangers retaliated with a sequence of counter-raids, seeking vengeance for the spilt blood of innocents. And by January of 1915, a Mexican group known as the Los Sedicionistas was baying for blood. They came up with what was called the Plan of Santiago, a scheme which called for a race-based conflict that would rid the American border states of their Caucasian population, paving the way for eventual annexation by the Mexican government. Although a full-scale invasion of the United States never took place, the Sedicionistas were steadfast in their commitment to causing chaos north of the border, and actually took on companies of United States Army infantry who attempted to repel their attacks. Naturally, such escalating violence led to increasing tensions between the two nations, and that tension wasn't just confined to governments or militaries. And increasingly, Mexican Americans and refugees alike found themselves being hunted down by shadowy gangs of hateful vigilantes, beginning a period that would come to be known in Spanish as La Matanza, the massacre. On November 2nd, 1910, 20-year-old migrant worker Antonio Rodriguez was returning home from his day's labor. He has recently moved to Rock Springs, Texas in search of work and was said to be grateful to have escaped the chaos of the Mexican Revolution for a better life in the U.S. But on that cool November evening, Antonio found himself under arrest for the murder of an American citizen. Furious local Texans were so enraged by the murder that they didn't even wait to give Antonio a trial, and during the night, a lynch mob sprang him from his jail cell, then walked him out to a bonfire they had built in the street outside. Then, to the horror of all in attendance, the mob threw the young migrant worker onto the flames, watching him burn as his screams echoed through the dusty frontier streets. Antonio was the first victim of La Matanza, a young man who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The following June, another young Mexican named Antonio Gomez was walking through his hometown in Thorndale, Texas, when he was approached by a group of angry-looking men. They accused Antonio of being a seditionista raider, something the 14-year-old was entirely innocent of. After all, he was American-born and raised, the son of 2 first-generation immigrants. But the mob wasn't interested in his side of the story, and as they tried to take his life right then and there, Antonio chose to defend himself. In doing so, he ended up killing a German man by the name of Charles Zichong. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Accused the boy of murder, then put him in a position where he had to kill in order to save his own life. Local law enforcement saw that the townsfolk were ready and willing to dole out their own brand of mob justice, so they were quick to place Antonio under arrest so they could keep him safe in a jail cell. Yet as the sheriff and his men attempted to move Antonio to the county jail over in Cameron to further ensure his safety, they found themselves being intercepted and ambushed by a masked mob, who forced the lawmen to hand over the captive Antonio at gunpoint. The mob then put a noose around Antonio's neck and hanged him from a nearby tree. The poor boy's family only got the news when they were chased out of town the following day with the same men that had taken their son from them. La Matanza peaked in January of 1918 when B Company of the Texas Rangers surrounded the village of Porvenir in Presidio County. Led by Captain James Fox Monroe and accompanied by a detachment of the 8th Cavalry Regiment, the Texas Rangers roused the most Mexican-American residents from their bed at around 2 a.m. The men were separated from the women, with the fighting-age males being led away to a secluded spot on the edge of the pueblo. There, the Rangers massacred them, firing off every single round they had into their victims until all 15 were lying bullet-ridden in puddles of their own warm blood. Word of the massacre spread quickly, and as news of the Porvenir massacre reached the ears of Mexicans all over Texas, they decided they'd had enough. There they were, trapped between the violent civil war that had engulfed their homeland and the hatred and suspicion of those north of the border, with many Mexican immigrants deciding that it would be better to die on home soil instead of being hunted down in a foreign land. But the terrifying thing about La Matanza isn't so much the horrendous violence that the innocent were subjected to, but that the same sour sentiment seems to have been echoed in recent years. During the summer of 2019, descendants of those murdered during La Matanza spoke of their concerns regarding the anti-Mexican sentiment they felt was re-entering American discourse. Just a few months later, Patrick Crusius walked into the El Paso branch of Walmart, killing 23 people in just 6 minutes. Police believe a manifesto with white nationalist and anti-immigrant themes posted on the online message board 8chan shortly before the attack was written by Crusius. It cites the years earlier Christchurch mosque shooting in New Zealand and the right-wing conspiracy theory known as the Great Replacement as inspiration for the attack. 100 years after La Matanza, and the same poisonous hatred still persists among those fearful enough to believe that simple migrant workers constitute some kind of dangerous invasion. And in doing so, they play into the hands of those on both sides of the border who wish to exploit and divide us. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/letsreadofficial and give and receive feedback from the community and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join a live stream to catch an invite to my Discord. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Muchas gracias, amigos. Y nos vemos pronto.